Um, Washington faced three areas of conflict, one in the west and the east and the south. The east, that was Europe across the sea. There was a revolution going on. In the west, there was a brutal Indian war going on. In the south, a slave rebellion scared the people of the United States, starting off then with the Indians. England gave the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Indians, and when they did so, they did not consult the Indians. Now, I'm talking mainly about this territory that's today Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois. They did not consult the Indians, and the Indians were promised that no whites would encroach on their land, but that was a promise that was difficult to keep, owing to the fact that the population was growing, the white population was growing really fast. George Washington once said that it would take an army several times bigger than any army he could collect to try to keep all the whites out. I mean, that territory is quite huge. And in those days, I mean, there just simply wasn't enough manpower, enough of an army to keep the white people from moving in and settling in. The Ohio governor, the unpopular Governor St. Clair, sent an army to fight the Indians, and the Indians handed St. Clair the worst defeat that the white man had ever faced in a battle with the Indians. So George Washington then sent a bigger army to the area, and he sent a general whom he had worked with during the Revolutionary War, General Mad Anthony Wayne. He was called Mad because he drank a lot. Unfortunately, a heavy drinker. Now, Anthony Wayne grew up near Waynesboro in southern Pennsylvania, and when I was 10 years old, and during my 11th birthday, for about 15 months or so, my family lived in Waynesboro, named after Anthony Wayne, and the biggest hotel in Waynesboro was the Anthony Wayne Hotel. Anyway, Anthony Wayne went out west, and yes, there's a place in Ohio called Wayne Trace where he is known to have traveled with his army. He defeated the Indians in Battle of Fallen Timbers. Now, he knew the Indians had a custom that when a battle was about to be fought, the Indians did not eat. This was designed to make them, it was believed that food would slow them down. Well, Anthony Wayne pretended he was going to give battle. The Indians didn't eat, and this went on for 10 days. By that time, the Indians were too weak to fight. So Anthony Wayne had an easy time with them. Well, Fallen Timbers, apparently a tornado had hit the area at some point and knocked down a whole bunch of trees. That's where it got the name Fallen Timbers. So they made a treaty with the Indians in which the Treaty of Greenville, and they promised the Indians goods if the Indians would keep the peace. The goods came in the form of hatchets and blankets. Now, much too often the goods came in the form of liquor, which the Indians did not need. Liquor affects people of Asian descent, a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people of Asian descent differently than it does other people, and the effects are better off if left undescribed. I could go into detail because I saw some Asian men when I was in the Army drink, and I'll leave it at that. But it had a worse effect on them than it did on African people or European people. Now, the Indians of today, thanks to the Treaty of Greenville, do not have to get a license to hunt or to fish. They can go to any lake they choose and not hunt. If a cop asks for a license, they just have to say, I'm of American Indian descent, and probably the cop will leave them alone. The blankets that were given to them are believed to have been used by people who had had smallpox. We do not know if this was a deliberate attempt to spread smallpox among the Indians or not, but this story is told that it was a deliberate attempt at decimating the Indian population. The Indians had no resistance to smallpox. But again, we don't know if they knew that much about sanitation. Now, the other thing, and folk, this is something some might have a hard time understanding. When you think the government is going to take care of you and take care of your needs, you become soft and lazy and basically non-productive. This is what happened to the Indians. They thought, hey, the government's going to give us drink, the government's going to give us food, the government is going to supply us with hatchets and whatever and blankets. We don't have to work. And the quality of their life greatly declined. All right. War between France and England. In France, a revolution broke out. If you study world history, you'll find that France went through several revolutions, but the first one was a revolution that occurred in 1792, and at first Americans supported it, but then the revolution took an unexpected turn. The revolution, among other things, kicked all Christianity out, took over all churches, and basically converted the churches into houses for houses of reason. And a lot of Americans who were Christian, and even those who weren't, said, hey, no, this is not freedom of religion, this is not religious tolerance even. And Americans after that decided they were not sure which side they were on. Also, it had been the King of France who had helped the Americans. Well, eventually the King of France and his wife, Marie Antoinette, the King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, both had their heads chopped off. And a lot of Americans did not see the reason for that, because the King and Queen of France were innocent of, well, the Queen was very extravagant, spent a lot of public money on a big park that, but anyway, a lot of persons felt that neither one of them deserved the death penalty. The French Revolution appeared to be leading to complete total anarchy, as at least 5,000 persons were beheaded, some of them for nothing more than not supporting the revolution with all their might and with all their hearts, just not supporting it strong enough. Well, England and France then went to war, and at this point America had to decide which side it was on. A lot of Americans began to trade with England, and a lot of merchants got rich with that trade with England. These people wanted the United States to remain neutral to where they could trade with both sides. President Washington issued a neutrality proclamation claiming that we would not take sides in the war. Well, no matter what you do, somebody's going to be upset. The persons who favored France were unhappy with the neutrality revolution. They said, no, we ought to just trade with France and leave England out of it. Well, the United States continued to trade with France through the West Indies. The West Indies, the France still had some territory in the West Indies. More than 300 American ships were caught trading with France, which England captured. And at this point, George Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty. Now, here was what John Jay had to try to do. He knew that Southern planters wanted to be paid for the slaves they had lost lost at the hands of the British during the Revolutionary War. Also, a lot of merchants wanted compensation from the British. Jay was unable to get either one. The merchants who had lost their ships just simply had to lump their losses. The Southern planters who had lost their slaves had to take their losses. The British government refused to pay. But the British in the Northwest Territory were given 18 months. Now, at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British promised they'd leave the Northwest Territory, but they were really, really slow in doing so. So they were given 18 months longer to leave. In the meantime, the debts that the Southern farmers owed to Great Britain, those were to be paid. In other words, basically the treaty seems to favor the British. But some favorable commercial treaty agreements were made. Jay sent the treaty to President Washington, but on the way to President Washington, someone got hold of the treaty and published an unfavorable article about the treaty. There was a lot of protests made against it, but the treaty passed the Senate. The House passed funds for it. So the treaty with Great Britain stood. Okay, for the moment we were at peace with Great Britain, our former enemy. Now in the South, in the island of Hispaniola, there were two nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Haiti was owned by the French. While the French were fighting a revolution, a slave rebelled against the French. The French sent an army. The army came down with malaria. The French army could not take the tropical climate. Also, the French government could not spare a big enough army to put down the slave revolt. This was the only slave revolt in the history of the West, that is, the history of the Western world, that actually worked. In that, the slaves defeated the French. The Europeans living in Haiti, some of them fled to the Dominican Republic across the border, but some of them were so frightened that they took to the sea in ships. Some of them came to the United States. There was a lot of slaughter, particularly of former black slaves against the whites. And the people in the southern people, particularly in the southern states, feared that the uprising would spread to the slaves' United States. It did a little bit, but for the most part it did not. There was an uprising, which we'll talk about later today, but for the most part, the feared uprising did not spread to the United States. But Thomas Jefferson and other Southerners said, we're not going to buy any more slaves from the West Indies because they'll be encouraged to rebel. All right, George Washington has served as president for 8 years, and he decided not to run again. This set a precedent. From that time on, for the next more than 100 years, presidents did not serve more than 8 years. We finally had one who did, Franklin Roosevelt, served for 12 years. But then shortly afterwards, Congress passed an amendment, a constitutional amendment, that said the president must not serve more than 2 terms. They felt like it gave one party too much power. Now, this was the first election where it was not unanimous. In the case of Washington, all the electors had voted for him. He was elected unanimously both times. There was no popular vote. But what they did, and this was something the Founding Fathers did not want to happen, the candidates would go to the electors and beg for the electors to vote for them. The electors were the men who were chosen to be in the Electoral College. The Federalists had 2 parties now. The Federalist and Republican, which was something George Washington had absolutely not wanted. The Federalists chose John Adams and Thomas Pinckney, while the Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Well, now I'm going to get back to the election in a minute, but I want to say more about George Washington's farewell address. George Washington wanted the United States to stay out of entangling alliances. His exact words are, why should we quit our stand on foreign affairs? In other words, we've stayed out of foreign alliances. Let's not entangle ourselves in the affairs of other country. Now, you've got to keep in mind, folk, this was before there were telephones, before there were jet aircraft, before you could cross the Atlantic Ocean in 8 hours, or maybe even less. The world is a different place than it was then. Nevertheless, Washington's advice was followed by our presidents for the next 100 years. Finally, William McKinley got the United States involved in world affairs. But for the first 100 years, our presidents stayed out of entangling alliances, taking their advice from Washington. in today's world, again, our world of jet aircraft and our need for oil, it's just difficult to imagine not making alliances with foreign countries. But in Washington's day, we did not need all that oil. We did not need all those goods that we now have to get from abroad, and in turn, a lot of them did not even need our goods. All right. Now, here was the way that the election was run back then, back to the election of 1796. The electors would put two names on the ballot. Even if they wanted one to be president and one to be vice president, they put them on the ballot. Now, the 12th Amendment changed that. With the 12th Amendment, the electors now vote for president on one ballot and vice president on another. But this was to create a problem 4 years later. It was something that did not bother them when they were electing Washington unanimously. But basically what it was the man who got the most votes became president, and the one who got the second most votes became vice president. So, John Adams wound up with the most votes, but his running mate, Thomas Pinckney, was outdone. So we had a vice president of a different party. Now, everyone who had voted for Thomas Jefferson meant for him to be president. And nevertheless, Thomas Pinckney, not everyone who voted for John Adams voted for Thomas Pinckney. Now, today, don't try that. When you're voting for president, you have to vote for the vice president who's running. A lot of persons have tried to vote for one person for president and a person from a different party for vice president. They won't count that either way. Well, but in those days, they just simply put two names on the ballot. When the ballot votes were counted, John Adams got to be president, Thomas Jefferson vice president. So we had a president of one party and a vice president of another. Well, Hamilton did a lot to try to influence the election of Pinckney, but this is one time Hamilton tried to use his influence and it backfired. All right. Adams promised that he would be above politics. It proved to be impossible, even as it really had proven to be impossible for George Washington. Jefferson advised President Adams one time. Adams rejected his advice, and Thomas Jefferson never did advise John Adams again. The two men became political enemies, and they will remain political enemies till late in their life. I'll have more to say about that later. All right. France hated the treaty we made with Great Britain, and they claimed that it made America a British satellite. So France then seized some 300 American vessels and confiscated all the goods on those vessels. President Washington sent a new minister to France. France would not recognize him. In the meantime, France sent a man to us named Citizen Genet. Genet talked down to Washington and his cabinet and all the American government officials like they were children, and once scolded Washington in childish tones, really high-handed. But then when the government of France changed, Citizen Genet appealed to Washington, "Don't send me back to France, I'll be beheaded." So Washington wound up allowing Citizen Genet to live here. The term citizen was the way, it was like the communists used to call each other comrade. Hello, comrade. But citizen was the term that they were using to address each other in France at the time. All right. Now, Talleyrand took over. Talleyrand was high-handed, Talleyrand. He was running France at the time. 3 American ambassadors were sent to try to talk the French government. Well, instead, Talleyrand sent 3 agents known to the Americans as Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. I don't know if we know who they actually were, but 3 agents came from Talleyrand, and they offered a bribe. In other words, they offered a bribe to the American ambassadors. The American ambassadors were terribly offended and left France for Washington. And this led to what we call the unofficial war, quasi-war, where that war was not actually declared, but Americans went and began capturing French merchant ships even as they had captured ours. And it looked like a war with France was imminent. Well, the United States began preparing for war. We began building battleships. We raised an army of 10,000 troops. The very old George Washington, he was by now about 66 years old, was made head of the army. Hamilton, a lot of persons have accused and still do accuse Hamilton of trying to lobby to be second in command. And it made Hamilton unpopular. But the country was on the verge of a civil war. A lot of persons were for the war with France, a lot of persons were against it. And Adams even armed himself, fearing he was going to be attacked personally. Under this kind of pressure, in a moment of near panic, the Congress, controlled by the Federalists, passed a series of very unpopular laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act said no one is allowed to speak against the government. The Alien Act said French immigrants are to be discouraged from coming to the United States. This immigrant business and who's allowed to come is nothing new, folk. We did not want the French coming over here, fearing that they might stir up rebellion. Now, Jefferson, Madison, the Republicans opposed the acts, but they could not get enough votes to keep them being passed. This goes down in history as the biggest mistake John Adams ever made. So they decided, well, how can we get the acts nullified? And this was the beginning of a crisis that was to eventually lead to civil war. Nullification. Do the states have a right to nullify laws that they don't like? In other words, if a Congress passes a law and our state doesn't like it, can the state say this law is not going to be enforced here? Nullification was one of the things that led to the Civil War, but it started within a few years after our government got started. During the term of our second president, John Adams, a bunch of state legislatures said these laws were unconstitutional. Now, folk, this nullification thing is still going on. The state of California has said that they're not going to obey laws that are passed by Congress concerning immigrants, particularly ICE laws. And they're saying we're not going to enforce ICE in our state. So the federal government, does it have jurisdiction over California or not? This is something that has gone on several times through history. Well, President Adams finally realized that Hamilton had duped him, so he kept a calm head, though, and did not enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts, or he used a lot of restraint in enforcing them. He realized that France was not eager for war, so to his credit, instead of actually going to an all-out war, he made one more attempt to negotiate. So he sent a team of 5 men to negotiate with the French government. Actually, he sent a team, I forget how many men. He sent a team to negotiate with the French government. And after those ambassadors set sail, in France, Napoleon overthrew the French government and set himself up as a dictator, and eventually as emperor. And Napoleon was eager for peace with the United States, so war was averted. Now, John Adams was one of our more unpopular presidents. Of our first 5 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all of them served for 8 years except for John Adams. Washington 8 years, Jefferson 8 years, Madison 8 years, Monroe 8 years. John Adams only served 4. His son, who came next after Monroe, also only served 4. Both men had problems with a lack of popularity. The peace initiative, while historians commend him for it, they're saying we did not need another war with France. Nevertheless, it sealed his fate as a one-term president. So the election of 1800 occurred. Thomas Jefferson was the winner. Politics was here to stay. Party politics was here to stay. Okay.